Hello and welcome to Scotland at 7. I'm Hugh Stewart, and with me in the Glasgow studio is Linda Fabiani. So Linda is the previous Deputy Speaker, Deputy Presiding Officer at the Scottish Parliament, and you decided to retire last May, so you're out of that. So we're going to begin today, Linda, with some of the political turmoil that you're no longer part of, but looking down at number 10, I don't think anything like this ever happened at number 10. So we'll begin looking at the latest in the number 10 political crisis, then we're going to look at the economic crisis. So really, this is Crisis Friday, isn't it? So let's begin with the number 10. Now, yesterday we heard that I think 4 of Boris Johnson's top political advisors had resigned. Up to yesterday, and we'll update that news shortly. So by yesterday we heard that the Prime Minister had lost his policy chief and his chief of staff and his principal private secretary and also his director of communications. So we heard yesterday that this was being spun as the promised reorganisation. So remember, a week ago Prime Minister Johnson said that he was shocked by the party's revelations and he was going to make changes to the number 10 team. So has he done that, Linda, or has the team changed itself?
Oh, you know, the spin that's going on is just amazing at the moment. No, I don't think for a minute that this is a deliberate strategy by the Prime Minister or even those of his advisors who are left. I think it's basically people leaving the sinking ship. You know, they've had enough. I mean, what I would say is I wouldn't take away from a degree of perhaps genuine feeling about some of the remarks that Boris Johnson has made recently. There may be a bit of that. There may be one of the folk I think was a civil servant, so there may well be a view in that chap's mind that if he sent that email telling people to bring their own bottle, well, it's no way for a civil servant to behave. So perhaps there's a case with some of them going before they were pushed. But I absolutely do not believe for a minute that this has been orchestrated by the Prime Minister and his allies. I think folk are fleeing, they see the chaos, the crisis that is all around, and they don't want to be part of it any longer. And I understand there's been another one today, and there may well be more to come.
Yes, the latest news we heard this morning is that Elena Narozhansky, who was a special advisor to the Prime Minister on women and equalities, has also left the team. Now, this is thought to be particularly important because Narozhansky has actually been with Boris Johnson for something like 10 years. Mm-hmm. She was his advisor during his term as Mayor of London. So that's seen to be a really big departure. So Mike Russell today, I must credit Mike Russell for this one, he says, arguing that this is a deliberate reorganisation or a reshuffle, it's a bit like the captain on the Mutiny of the Bounty saying that he's just reorganised his officer team. So this is another maybe a principled resignation because Narozhansky seems to have resigned because of the disgraceful remarks the Prime Minister Johnson made the other day, linking Keir Starmer to the Jimmy Savile scandal. So that apparently was the last straw for Elena Narozhansky.
Well, I mean, I get that. The First Lady, whose name escapes me right now, who resigned yesterday.
Oh, that would be Munira Mirza.
Yes, Mirza. She'd been with him for many, many years too. So that's 2 people who have worked with Boris Johnson for many years prior to him becoming Prime Minister have just said enough's enough. And I think Mike Russell's got a wonderful way with words, and he's absolutely right. You know, folk get to the stage where they just say, I just can't take any more of this. You know, and there's also a bit of self-preservation for their own careers as well. And that's not a criticism, because people are working, that's what they do. So I have a certain sympathy for those that feel they have to go, because even though I don't agree with the principles of that government, and I would hope that those who do work for that government actually believe in their principles as well, rather than just look at it as a job. So even though I disagree fundamentally with so much that they do, it's very, very hard when you've had a great loyalty to something to walk away from it. And if they're at the end of their tether, well, they're at the end of their tether and they've gone. I just wish that more elected members would do the same. You know, I'm absolutely aghast at some of the defence that is going on of Boris Johnson by some of the Tories. How can they possibly justify keeping this man in office and having that buffoon in charge of what's very serious issues going on within the country today?
Well, just to update myself, I'm just checking actually, I was mistaken, let me get that right. It was Mirza who had been with Prime Minister Johnson for something like 14 years.
That's right, yeah.
Not, I don't know how long Norizhansky had been there. But it was certainly the lies, now we can say that, can't we? The lies that Johnson told. In his defence the other day, he changes the subject, of course. He says, my answer to the question of was I at a party is that we've got the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe. Now, that's not true.
No.
But also he said, I don't know if it's just occurred to him on the spur of a moment, he also decided to accuse Keir Starmer of deliberately sitting on the Jimmy Savile inquiry. Now, that also is a thing that's not true. What do we call those statements that are not true? What's the word for
Lies.
that? Yeah.
He also said that the crime rate had fallen, and that has since been disproved.
It's actually increased, yeah.
Yeah.
In England, yeah. In fact, LBC News had a big story the other day about crime in England and about the failure of the police to find most of them. So, in fact, the crime story is not a good story unless you tell lies about it. So, Ian Blackford, of course, is not allowed to call the Prime Minister a liar in the House of Commons, but we can here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Isn't it ludicrous, Hugh? You know, someone lies in the House of Commons. Boris Johnson just lies all the time in the House of Commons. And then when Ian Blackford calls him out, he's the one that's accused of going against what's right in the parliamentary system and gets escorted away by some guy wearing tights. I mean, it's just completely ludicrous. The way that there's time for a big overhaul. That place is broken.
It's a bit medieval, isn't it?
Yes.
Incidentally, on that question then, what are the rules in the Scottish Parliament if a member says something that if you were in charge of a session and somebody clearly lies, what would you do in those occasions?
Well, it's very, very difficult because the chair, the speaker, the presiding officer is not responsible for what people say in the chamber, right? I mean, if you're sitting in the chair, if you think, and I did it a few times, if you think things are getting a bit near the bone, you will pull somebody up. It's quite difficult, but what you also have to remember is Westminster has what's called privilege. They can say anything they like in the chamber with no consequences. Scottish Parliament doesn't have privilege. So things that are said in the chamber can be actionable. So the presiding officer also has to be very aware that sometimes maybe have to stop somebody saying something because actually you could get yourself into deep trouble here.
So for their own good.
Always aware of the law.
Right. Okay,
Yeah.
so the rules are a bit simple and a bit more straightforward. And so in Scotland, people know that they have to be careful what they say.
Yeah.
If you make an allegation, make sure you've checked it out. Boris Johnson, however, just makes things up. Doesn't have any need to check things out before he says them in the chamber. Well, so that was the latest on... now, just before we move on, we don't, of course, know how many of these famous 54 Conservatives have written their letters. The situation is within the Conservative Party, this has nothing to do with the Constitution of Britain or the devolution settlement or anything. Within the Conservative Party, it's up to 54 members of Parliament to say they have no confidence in the Prime Minister. And then all that happens is they have a vote. So presumably, if those 54 then agreed to a no confidence vote, and if Labour and the SNP backed it, then the Prime Minister would have to resign. But we have no idea how many have written the letter, and I assume even if 54 did, I assume they would also back the no confidence vote if it happens.
Yeah, well, there's also a thing entirely within the Conservative Party that if they get the 54 letters, it triggers a leadership election. So I was reading opinions of various commentators who'd been speaking to backbenchers and others, and they feel that Boris Johnson would actually win that at the moment. And that fills me with despair. We've got a party of government in the UK that would keep Boris Johnson in charge, somebody like him, in very serious times. I mean, for example, can you imagine Boris Johnson if a war broke out or whatever, and we've got a big problem in the Ukraine at the moment? We've got all these crises going on, and you've got somebody who wouldn't know the truth if it hit him in the face, who just says anything that comes into his head just to look after his own position. And these people are willing to have him in charge. I find that incredibly worrying. So the Conservative Party have got a big issue there. You know, these MPs should be looking at themselves and saying, really? Is it credible for us to back that man as our leader? Ergo, the Prime Minister? Hard.
Right, but again, it's up to the famous 54, the famous fighting 54. So obviously we know at the moment 54 have not written a letter. So, well, again, this is one of these stories we'll come back to.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move on now from the political crisis in Downing Street to the economic crisis in Downing Street. So we'll first of all, Linda, look at the energy crisis, which affects you and me and everybody watching, and indeed Broadcasting Scotland. So our bills are going up too. So let's first of all look at the effects of the big increases in your electricity bills. Well, to begin with, the facts are that people have probably heard this week, the electricity bills have already gone up, but not as much as they're going to, because there has been a price cap under the old legislation. But the price cap comes off in April. And so it was announced yesterday that everyone's bills will probably go up by another £700 a year, putting people into something like £2,000 a year average electricity and gas bill. Okay, so that's the size of it. Now, we hear from, let me just look at the numbers here. So, quoting from Rishi Sunak has said that he is aware that households are suffering from Britain's worst energy cost of living crisis for a generation. And Rishi Sunak has promised a £9 billion emergency package. So in a couple of minutes, Linda, we're going to discuss whether that's enough. Let's look at what's been announced first of all. The Resolution think tank, a research group, says that something like 5 million people in Britain will now be in what they class as fuel stress, or I suppose that's really what people sometimes call fuel poverty. Now, they describe that as any household where 10% of your budget has to be spent on heating the house. So that's 5 million people. Also, under the Treasury Plan, resolution says that 28 million customers will have, but this is what Rishi Sunak has announced, they will have £200 knocked off their bills this October, but then they will repay that at £40 a year over the following 5 years. So that's Rishi Sunak's solution to this really worst energy crisis for a generation. Now, let's just look at that first of all. The measures, do the measures come anywhere near meeting the extent of this problem?
Well, do you know, Hugh, I've been trying to work out exactly what this is that Rishi Sunak's saying. You know, it's getting billed as help, universal help for all bill holders, but it's actually a loan, right? So.
Yep.
And I was trying to get clarity on it and couldn't get it anywhere. And the closest we've got is the wonderful Martin Lewis. And I ran off a couple of things he said. And what he's saying was, in practice, this £200 loan will come through in October to all home electric bills. So every bill will reduce by £200. And then after April 23, every bill increases by £40 a year for 5 years. Now, what he's saying is, regardless if you get the £200 or not. So it's a 1 year bill reduction followed by a 5 year compulsory levy, right? So it all sounds very weird. And then when you look at that further, does that mean that somebody who wasn't a householder or a bill holder in October this year, they end up having to pay back £40 in every bill if they happen to become that householder after that?
Yeah, that's right.
It all seems very, very strange.
So everybody, yeah, Martin Lewis has said, I've noted, he says everybody will pay back £40 a year.
Yeah.
So yeah, people who are just setting up a house, well, next November, won't get the £200, but they'll still have to pay it back. So this means Rishi Sunak will get more money back than he's putting out.
And Martin Lewis is saying, and I quote him, my use of the word every is not accidental. There is no opt-out. And yet again, we have a very unfair system imposed by the UK government with no chance to opt out. And I mean, I consider myself very fortunate that I'm not in any kind of poverty. My goodness, how lucky I am. And so many of us are compared to others. And when I think about folk who are suffering Already we're suffering fuel poverty because it's not a new thing. There's not all these people suddenly been taken over that 10%. There's a lot of people already over that 10%. And the idea of £700 a year more on that is horrendous. On top of cuts in universal credit, on top of general inflation and everything that's going on, it's huge. And what they do is they come up with this crackpot idea instead of really working out how people can be helped and coming up with a good system of help. And then, to make it even worse, when you look at the profits of the energy companies, it would make you want to spit.
Well, I've got some information on that which we'll come to in a couple of minutes.
Right.
So before we move on to the North Sea bonanza, and because there is an interesting question there about why are energy prices going up when we've actually got a surplus of energy, right? So we'll look at that in a couple of minutes because there's a lot we need to unpick there. But before we move on from Rishi Sunak's generosity, which as we've just worked out means he'll get back more than he gives, Alison Thulis for the SNP has said that almost 500,000 people in Scotland will have to cut back on food to deal with the unaffordable energy bills. Now, before we go back to what the SNP have argued, let me first quote Rishi Sunak. He said, talking about the energy crisis, that there is nothing the government could do. Now, he's referring to international energy prices, but I'd like to remember that phrase, nothing we could do. Because Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor for Labour, she said, here's something you could do. You could cut the VAT on energy bills. It's only 5% though, but that still means for every additional £100 you pay in your energy bill, that's another £5 goes to Rishi Sunak, and it's going to go up by 700. So in fact, we're giving Sunak another £35 a year, and then we're paying back £40 a year 5 years after that. So,
do you know, there's a lot of things in this, Hugh. Now, first of all, the VAT thing, yes, that's valid that could be cut. And I read last night, actually, that the Belgian government is cutting VAT on fuel, on energy. I think it's a temporary measure, but they're doing it, so it can be done, and that the UK government have ruled that out. There's also the issue that if you look back to, Scotland's last referendum, when we were asking people to vote to allow us to make our own decisions in life, all the stuff that was coming out from the Better Together campaign was how your fuel bills were going to go up.
that's right, I remember that.
And all the rest of it. I mean, absolute nonsense, and here we are. But for Rishi Sunak and the government to be saying nothing can be done, of course things can be done. Of course they can. And one of the things that I've often thought is, all the green energy measures that we're taking and all the green initiatives that we're taking, that's all being paid for through the price of energy, because you get the big energy companies who are going on about, we're doing this and we're doing that with wind power and that and wave power and everything else. That's all being paid for through people's bills. Now, the government could take a decision to fund all that stuff through income tax, which actually is a much fairer and more progressive way of raising money. So that's just one thing that could be done. There's loads of different things that could be done. Keeping people in poverty by stuff like this is a choice of government. It's not inevitable. And they have chosen to do this.
Yeah, the government does have measures it can use. Now, to go back to Alison Thulis, we said earlier on 5 million people are probably going to be in fuel poverty throughout the UK, and Citizens Advice Scotland suggests that 500,000 people in Scotland have had to cut back on food because of unaffordable bills. So Alison Thulis has gone on to say that what they're doing is they should turn the loan into a grant. In other words, the very first thing Sunak should do is say, there's 200 quid, we're not going to ask you for it back. So they could easily do that, as we've said, because of the increase in tax revenue they're already getting. Also, Citizens Advice Scotland suggests that 640,000 people in Scotland are finding their energy bills unaffordable, and almost 500,000 have had to cut back on food to deal with the energy bills. So lastly, Alison Thulis also suggested other things the UK government could do, including introducing a major energy grant, reversing its cuts to universal credit, matching the Scottish Child Payment Scheme UK-wide, and bringing forward a real living wage. So if Rishi Sunak is struggling for ideas, there's a few he could start to think on. Right, we're going to move on to, I think I could call this the other part of the economic crisis, which you've already referred to, Linda. We're going to look at the North Sea cash machine. Now, oil and gas in the North Sea is booming. And that's another thing I remember during the independence referendum. Remember, first of all, North Sea gas was going to run out, and oil and gas was going to run out. It should have run out 2 or 3 years ago. And then, of course, also a couple of years ago, Sir Ian Wood was asked by the Conservative government to look at the crisis of the North Sea, remember, because they weren't making any money. They had to cut back on costs, otherwise the whole thing would shut up shop, and they reorganised and brought down costs. Well, that's a good thing to do, but it brought down costs so well that the North Sea was described a couple of weeks ago by the chair of BP as a cash machine. So they're making money hand over fist. So, well, that's good news, isn't it? We thought the oil was going to run out, the oil and gas, but actually there's plenty of it and it's worth a fortune. Who knew?
Well, you know, it's certainly true that they said all this rubbish at the time of the referendum and would say it again every chance they get. But, you know, Scotland, as an independent nation, would not be dependent on the North Sea. Anything from the North Sea is a bonus, and particularly now, when you look at what we're doing, which is we have to go towards what gets badged as a just transition to start to move away from oil and gas and be looking at more renewable energy. And you know, we're doing fairly well on that. So it's never as simple. It's not as simple as, you know, those that say, oh, we can rely on the North Sea. Nor is it as simple as saying we have to start levying and everything else. There's a whole big picture there that's got to tie in with the just transition. And I just don't hear anybody coming forward with really sensible ways to manage this. I wouldn't pretend that I could, but then I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on energy policy or indeed in economic policy in relation to energy and in relation to the North Sea and its resources. So I would like to see, instead of everybody looking for sound bites in all of this, instead of slagging each other off all the time about it, I would like to see something really sensible and some really good discussion going ahead about how we manage the resources in the North Sea. Because I don't think for a minute you can just shut it down overnight like, you know, some people seem to think you can, because then we would just start importing oil and gas from other places. So I don't think it's as simple. I think Labour were calling for a windfall tax, a one-off windfall tax. I don't know what effect that would have on the industry and where the industry is just now. But I do know that nobody is sensibly planning out the future that I can see.
Well, the windfall tax has been proposed by Labour because of the huge profits that are being made this year and last year. Shell, for example, I read, has quadrupled its profits to historic highs, North Sea profits that is, which of course is fueling the call for a windfall tax. Shell has reported better than expected profits of $6.5 billion in dollars, that's 4.7 billion in sterling, for the final quarter. That's just for 3 months. With earnings of 393 million a year, driven by the surge in prices. Shell's profits overall for the year 21, rose to $19.3 billion, compared with $4.85 billion the year before. So the increase in prices is causing a huge increase in profits, which leads obviously to the natural demand to say, well, you didn't really do anything to make that extra profit, so the thing is, give some of it back.
I get that, you know, I can get that as a very upfront argument, but what I would say is, why are we looking at these persistent profits that these companies make from our resources and waiting until they reach a high and then saying, oh, let's have a windfall tax? Why don't we have a proper fair tax system that looks at this overall? Why are taxes not paid just as a matter of course? Because that doesn't seem to be the case. Every so often somebody says, oh, look at that, we've got a crisis. What will we do? Oh, they've made a lot of money. Let's take it off them. I don't actually have a problem with taking it off them, But I would like to see a proper system of taxation in place that makes sense and does away with this need to have the argument every few years, because it comes round regularly.
Well, of course, businesses regularly pay corporation tax, and UK has one of the lower corporation taxes. It's not the lowest by any means. I think it's 20%. Don't quote me on that. I don't know if this is a thing that you've looked into, but people say that Norway is making a much better effort than Britain, Scotland, because Norway is making money from its North Sea developments, and whereas we, as we said before, after the Ian Woods report of a few years ago, we cut back tax in order to try and persuade the oil companies to stay in the North Sea. So it looks like they're getting away with it in the British sector, but they're having to pay in the Norway sector.
I don't know the detail of it, Hugh, I have to say, but what we do know is that Norway's oil fund is something that Scotland should have had as well, and never did have because of the way the North Sea and its resources were divvied up by the UK government, used to shore up UK finances. When they stopped manufacturing and went into financial services and everything else, wasted, squandered. We could have been where Norway is, and we're not. Had we been an independent country, I would like to think that whoever was in charge of that independent country would have been looking to Norway and working jointly with Norway to see how best our resources could service the people of the respective nations. That was never done.
Okay, now Norway, incidentally, also is paying a great deal towards the energy bills of its own citizens, so they're doing a great deal more than Rishi Sunak is doing. We're going to move on to, in a couple of minutes, to inflation, the other side of the economic crisis in Britain. But I'll just say before we move on that I agree with your comments on the just transition. Of course, because we're Scotland and because it's Scotland's oil, we have to discuss oil and gas. But of course, we've already discussed with others in this programme that we actually make renewables in Scotland as well. So we do have programmes scheduled in the future to look at the just transition. We've discussed it before, particularly during COP26. But of course, historically, the oil is there. And as you say, Linda, historically, Norway made trillions in their oil fund.
Yeah.
So we have to discuss that. But clearly, we agree that oil is the 20th century fuel, and we do have to move on. And we do have alternatives to move on to, because Scotland can be practically self-sufficient in renewables. So there is all that discussion, and we will come back to that in the future. But before we come back to the oil market, the oil and gas market, the other part of the economic crisis we're facing today, of course, is inflation, the return of inflation. Now, let me just look for my numbers here, because I like to get this right. I used to teach economics, Linda, so when I began...
I'm glad somebody here's an economic expert.
Well, I don't know if I'm an expert, but I don't know who else is in the government anyway. But the figures are, at the moment, that inflation... That's to say, the continuous rising in the general price level is something like 5.4%. Excuse me. That's the figures at the moment. Now, I don't know if that's the CPI or the other index. There's more than one way of measuring inflation. And in fact, if you look at, as we've said before, if you look at people's fuel inflation, it's a lot more than 5.4%. However, the official figures from the Bank of England are 5.4% general price rise at the moment, maybe rising to 7% this spring in the next couple of months. And that means that prices are rising faster than wages. So Andrew Bailey from the Bank of England says that he's concerned about higher borrowing costs because that itself, the decision he's just taken, is actually going to make households even poorer because they've raised the interest rate, the basic Bank of England's lending rate, to 0.5%. Now that doesn't sound like very much, but it's actually doubled because the interest rate was 0.25% and it's gone up to 0.5%. Now that's still historically low, but it does mean people on mortgages will be paying more. So that's another side of the cost of living crisis. So Andrew Bailey is saying at the Bank of England, we are aware that the decision we just took yesterday, I think, to put interest rates up, that itself is going to make people poorer, take more out of the household budget. So why did he do that? Why did he make people poorer? His argument is that, well, we know that the economy is not running away. Normally, you put prices up when the economy is supercharged and everything's going up, and you have to try and put the brakes on it. So the Bank of England is saying the economy is not running away. In fact, it's growing at something like 1.5% a year. So he's saying that's not why we're doing it. The reason we're doing it now is because, well, basically, we're worried about inflation. So if inflation is going up from 5 to 7, what economists are thinking, is it then going to go to 10 and then 15?
Oh my.
And then are we going to be back in the 70s again? So there's no evidence that that's what's going to happen. But from what I read, it looks like Andrew Bailey at the Bank of England is saying, we really don't want to get into galloping inflation. We're not there yet, but let's just put the interest rates up to make sure that inflation doesn't keep increasing. So I think that's what's going on there. But Andrew Bailey himself is saying the decision we just took yesterday is going to make people poorer.
My goodness. Yes, it's a strange decision, and you know I have read some commentary on it by economists who are a bit concerned about it. And you know, you said there, Hugh, you take us back to the 70s, and I mean I think back to even the 80s and the early 90s. And it was mortgages that were high. People were having real problems because if they didn't have a fixed interest rate mortgage, the interest rate in mortgages was really high. And if folk are on the margins, even that 0.5% in keeping a roof over your head can make a big difference to your expendable income. And if you put that along with the rise in fuel and general inflation, and then think about the Bank of England saying this may actually make people poorer. I would like to know their definition of people poorer. Who are they talking about? Because it might make a lot of people poorer, but it will be a matter of getting through life for a lot of other people. And I just don't understand why they're doing that.
Well, to quote Andrew Bailey again, he said that we've not raised interest rates today because the economy is roaring away. An increase in the bank rate is necessary because it's unlikely that inflation would return to target without it. So it's basically saying we're going to bring down inflation. Target, by the way, is 2%. Economists like inflation as long as it's 2%. So for years it was below 2%, and the Bank of England had to explain why is it so low. We like a bit of inflation, but not too much.
Do you know, why do we like a bit of inflation? You tell me.
It seems to... people think they've got more money, therefore they spend more, therefore that puts more profits into business. If you like, it's not real money, it's an illusion, because if you get 2% more money and prices go up 2%, you don't realise until afterwards that prices gone up. Yes. But it still encourages you to start to go spending, and it still encourages people to start businesses.
But there's also that thing about saving, isn't it? You know, like the other side of the interest rate thing is what people get in their savings, and they think that's a great thing. But then, if you're having to pay that out in your mortgage and everything else, and inflation has caught up, it's a zero-sum game, isn't it?
Well, that's why they say they've taken this balance that 2% is okay. The other thing that inflation does is it makes your borrowings go away. So if you are borrowing either to buy a house or to start a business, then every few, I think you divide 70 by 2. So it means that if you've got 2% inflation, your borrowing disappears after 70 years. After 35 years. Really? 70 divided by 2 is 35, right? So basically, the higher inflation, the quicker your borrowings disappear. But at the same time, your savings disappear as well.
The other thing that I often think about these things, about how these decisions are made, who do they use as their benchmark? You know, because they must use somebody or some group of people as their benchmark as to what's going to be acceptable and what's not. And it's pretty certain that your benchmark is not the person sitting in the breadline. The benchmark is always higher up than that. So there's all these people below that benchmark who are getting a much harder time. And there's all these people above that benchmark that are actually having it pretty good.
Well, I think that is the problem.
It's unfair.
As I said earlier on, what exactly is inflation? It's your inflation is different to mine because it depends what we spend our money on. But the trouble is you really need 3 different consumer price indices. You need one for poor people, one for people who are getting by, and one for rich people.
But surely any decent society would base things on the poorest. That's what gets me,
That's a good point, yeah.
a fair society, a decent society, a society that I would love to have would be one which says, who's having the hardest time here? An unjustifiably hard time. Who is it? And what do we do to our economy to make it better for that person? And see if that person up there actually loses some of their savings, or can he afford this, that, or the next thing? Well, do you know, that's just the way it is. Because we should be collectively making sure everybody is above a certain line, and nobody should be going to a food bank. Nobody should be having to decide whether to heat their house or buy school shoes for their bairn, or indeed eat. And that's where it's all wrong as far as I'm concerned.
You know, you remind me of the words of John Rawls, the late American philosopher, and his principal contribution was about justice and fairness, and he would define a just policy as one that was good for the poor. That's exactly what he would say. Any policy would say, how does it work on the poor? And that's your yardstick as to whether that's a justified policy or not. Well, that's inflation up to about over 5% just now, according to one measure, and probably going to continue going up. So we have an increase in the interest rates. Still only 5%, still, Linda, let's not forget, both very low compared to where they were in the bad old days of the 70s. However, that's another worrying sign in the economy. On top of, as we said, the political crisis, if we're not really quite sure who's in charge. Incidentally, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak was quoted yesterday as, let's say, not being very full-hearted in his praise for Prime Minister Johnson. Now, these things, how do you know all about the way politicians speak? Rishi Sunak didn't actually come out and say, I think Johnson's useless, he's got to go. But he didn't exactly say the usual, did he? Which is to say, I have full confidence in the Prime Minister.
He's keeping his powder dry. I think he sees himself as a contender. You know, politics is a brutal game. Hugh, I mean, I saw some of that, you know, when I was there. It's just the way it is, sadly. But then, when you've got ambitious people in any walk of life, it can become brutal, can't it? And I suppose politics has more ambitious people than many others. Many other professions. So yeah, I think Rishi Sunak is seeing himself as a contender. I don't know who else is seeing themselves as such. Tom Tugendhat has said he will put his name forward if there's a leadership contest. The sort of old Tory type that I think their party likes very much. I think more people will start to pull away from Boris Johnson. I just don't know why I don't know why they ever elected him leader in the first place. And now that he's there, I don't know why it's taken so long to get shot of him, because he's useless. He's shown himself up for what he is. So.
Well, I know why they put Johnson in power, because I was listening to Michael Crick this morning on the radio. Crick has a new biography of Nigel Farage.
Aye.
And one point he was making is that Farage, of course, was a thorn in the side of the Conservatives for years, particularly when David Cameron was in charge. And so basically the Conservative solution, the Conservative survival to how to fight back against Farage was to put somebody just as bad in charge of the Conservatives.
But surely they realised they got it wrong, you know. They achieved what they thought they wanted to achieve, which was Brexit, right? They got that. And it's all fallen apart. Because so much that was, well, most things that were promised have never materialised. And then there's the debacle that is, you know, the agreements about Northern Ireland and ERA and everything else. It's a mess. It's a complete and utter mess. They're all backpedalling now. I mean, Boris Johnson, you know, saying, oh, it's ridiculous. Sorry, that's what you negotiated. That's what you signed up for. So surely the Tories can't still want that man there. They must know they've made a mistake. Why is he still there? It's a constant mystery to me.
Well, who knows? Well, most people say, I mean, you can't quote me on this, but I've heard a lot of commentators from the London lobby saying they think it's very unlikely that Johnson will be Prime Minister at the end of the year, and maybe the turning point will come with the May elections. That's council elections both here and in England.
But that's another 10 months. What can that man do in another 10 months? My goodness.
Well, so obviously that's a story that will continue. So I'm here on Sunday for the full Scottish, so we'll see if there's any developments over the weekend. We're going to move on then to the next part of our discussion tonight. So we've been looking at the economy, and I want to go back to an aspect of the energy market that we haven't really discussed up to now, which is the idea that I mentioned earlier on, Scotland actually is a net exporter of energy. So a lot of people I've been reading this week have been saying, if we're actually making so much energy, we can export it. How come it's so expensive? So I think what's going on here is the fact that it's, well, I think it's about privatisation. It's about the fact that the energy market was, of course, privatised by the Conservatives a long time ago, back in the Thatcher years, really. So when we talk about it's Scotland's oil or it's Scotland's gas, well, it's not, of course. It's not even the UK's. It belongs to the companies who have bought those licences, doesn't it? So I was looking at some figures the other day, which it raised the question of where do we actually get our gas from? You might assume, Linda, that if you have a gas central heating boiler, that you're burning North Sea gas, but you might not be. You might be burning gas from Qatar, or if it's from Norway, if it's from the North Sea, it's probably from Norway. So a lot of the North Sea gas in the Scottish sector is exported, and in fact, a lot of it is keeping houses warm right now in Netherlands. And Belgium, you mentioned Belgium earlier on, are subsidising their gas prices. Well, it's our gas they're using. Meanwhile, we're getting our gas from other sources. So that's just because it's a market. So the people who are exploiting the oil and gas, they're selling it on a world market, obviously for the best price they can get. So it's something to do with the structure of the market, isn't it? Why do we have high prices in the middle of a surplus? So surely it can only be explained by the way the market has been structured by privatisation.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. There was no care taken to, again, about looking at the best interests of the population, none at all. As I said earlier, it was about making maximum money to shore up the UK economy at the time for what was not a just transition, and getting rid of manufacturing and moving into service industries, etc. And those of us that are old enough will remember these years. And, you know, and it's too easy just to always say, oh, it was the Thatcher years. No, it was years of a British establishment that chose to do things that way. She was just the head of it. And, was backed up in an awful lot of it. And yes, that is a big problem. Scotland is an independent nation. Could look at how to change these things if that's what the people chose. And, that's what I hope for the future.
Yeah, well, this isn't a short-term solution, of course, but
No.
just as we failed, as you said earlier on, to make any public benefit out of oil and gas because the profits went to, of course, to private companies. Looking ahead, of course, we will have the vast bounty of North Sea wind and other sources, of course, from tidal and the Pentland Firth and other technologies. But that, of course, isn't going to heat people for the rest of the spring or for next winter. That's a few years ahead. But do you think is there any serious sense in the SNP and in the Scottish Government with the Green Party that we should nationalise the future renewable energy sources?
Well, there's certainly ongoing discussions in both parties. Now, I'm not in Parliament anymore, and I'm not in an executive position within my own party, the SNP, so I don't know what discussions are going on at either government level or top party level. Of course, I'm not in the Green Party either. So all I know is what I'm reading and what I'm picking up. I believe there is a will for nationalisation of these things. I mean, there was talk before of a national energy company. I understand, from what I've picked up, and that's no more than MD can pick up by looking at the public domain, that proved very, very difficult in terms of government, in terms of what can be done under the UK settlement and under devolution. I know it hasn't gone away because a lot of people feel strongly about it, which then brings me on to the recent Crown Estates licensing that went on for our wind and energy. I'm a wee bit concerned about some of that, but I'm waiting to see what comes forward about the ongoing supply chains, etc., and what benefit Scotland gets from that, and Scotland's companies, both in terms of manufacturing and servicing. So, a bit concerned, but I'll wait until I see more information about what's coming out about that.
Yeah, but if in future wind and other renewable resources are sold in the market in the same way as oil and gas is, it might well
Exactly.
be that we're selling our stuff to keep somebody else warm and then buying in more expensive
Yeah.
stuff from
We
somebody
should
else. That's
always
the way
look
the market
after our
goes.
own folks first, you know, while still having an obligation to help others in the world less fortunate than ourselves. That's the way it should always be. You know, that tenet about charity begins at home, but it certainly doesn't end there. And we should not have people in our own country living in the poverty that people are in, exacerbated by fuel poverty in a country like Scotland with all these natural resources. It's absolutely appalling.
Yep. So let's move on from energy. Again, we're going to come back to that one. Just to summarise, the bottom line is that Scotland, of course, is a net exporter of energy, but it's not Scotland's energy. It's not Scotland's oil. It belongs to whichever company has bought the rights to it, and including the wind energy at the moment, the rights have been bought by those companies who won the bid recently. I noticed on my Twitter, Claudia Webb, MP for Labour down south, has said the energy market has failed. Nationalise now. So if more people raised that I think clearly now would be a popular time to raise the question of how is the energy market structured?
Do you know, that's really interesting, because I seem to remember it was what's his name? Ed Miliband, who was Energy Secretary, that did the deal with the Big Four. No talk about nationalisation. Yeah. Labour are very, very good at coming out with all that stuff when they're in opposition. But, you know, they had 1997 to 2010. I don't remember any discussion at all about nationalisation.
A bit late, yeah.
Of anything, in fact.
So, well, that's the energy market. Again, obviously everyone's going to be talking about that as the rest of this winter and spring rolls on. Now, another story that's been rumbling yesterday and which we have an update on today is back to Brexit. You mentioned this earlier on. Now, of course, the key point about Brexit, the key test really has always been Northern Ireland, because like Scotland, of course, Northern Ireland voted to stay in Europe, but unlike Scotland, Northern Ireland was allowed to have a special arrangements were made for them by which they stay in the single market. Now, that, of course, hasn't pleased the Northern Ireland Unionist Party, which wants to stay in Britain. But at the same time, I get the impression, I think, Linda, that the idea of being able to trade freely with the South and with Europe actually is quite popular in Northern Ireland. So this really caused a political crisis for the Democratic Unionist Party. Anyway, the latest is, well, just to update you, yesterday, of course, we heard that, or was it the day before, we heard that Edwin Poots, who is the Agriculture Minister for the Northern Ireland Executive, unilaterally announced that he was pulling out of the Northern Ireland Agreement between Britain and Europe. And he had ordered officials in the Agriculture Department of Northern Ireland to immediately stop the checks on incoming goods, which had been agreed between Boris Johnson and the European Union, you know, back in 2019 when Boris got Brexit done. So Edwin Poots undid Brexit the other day. Well, that's been undone as well. Yeah. So today's news is that the High Court in Belfast has said he can't do that. So Brexit checks on food and farm products entering Northern Ireland from Great Britain, from the island of Great Britain, must continue pending a judicial review of the order made by Edwin Poots. This is the ruling today in the High Court of Belfast. Mr. Justice Colton said he was suspending Poots' order or the instruction given by the Minister of Agriculture until further order of this court. So, not surprisingly, Edwin Poots doesn't actually have the power to overrule an international agreement. What do you see are the main issues here? Is it the unionists not happy with the deal but not really able to do anything about it?
Right. Edwin Poots, I believe, knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that it was unlawful, but he was making a stand for whatever reasons, because the unionists want to remain part of the UK and have a big problem with the fact that there is a border in the Irish Sea, so to speak. They've always had that issue. Boris Johnson, I was absolutely stunned yesterday when Boris Johnson got interviewed and said, I mean, it's absolutely crazy that there are checks done between Britain and the North of Ireland. Really, Boris? Because you negotiated it, you signed up for it. That's where you took us. So the UK is trying to negate all responsibility for any of this and saying it's up to the Northern Ireland executive. It's just ludicrous. And I'm totally sceptical about the whole thing. Edwin Poots is well in with the Westminster establishment. He's been there for years and years. He's not just some guy that's come up through the Northern Ireland Assembly and decided to go his own way. He's part of the whole UK setup and has been for many, many years. There's been trouble with the power sharing in the north of Ireland for some time now. I mean, their assembly was suspended for nearly 3 years before it came back in. It was almost going back to direct rule from Westminster. I mean, that was the danger. And then the whole Brexit thing that was going on as well. So there's a lot of stuff in there. The Unionists are also really worried that come the next election, which is quite soon, that Sinn Féin will end up with the majority of the votes and end up with a Sinn Féin First Minister. The power sharing says that whoever wins the election gets the most seat. Their party becomes the First Minister and the other side becomes the Deputy First Minister. So the Unionists are really concerned about the polls which are showing Sinn Féin doing really well. And in fact have actually said that they may not go along with that even if Sinn Féin wins the election. So it's not just about the Brexit issue, it's about all the politics that are going on in the north of Ireland as well. So it's a right blooming mess. But for Boris Johnson to stand there and say it's up to them, nothing to do with us, is, again, a complete negation of responsibility. How can that man possibly be left in charge of it?
Yes, I well remember Boris Johnson saying on TV in a meeting to Northern Ireland businessmen, this is 2 years ago, is saying there will be no checks on goods travelling between, this could be a ship road from Stranraer to Larne, he said, and if you get any paperwork, you have to throw it in the bin. Take it from me, he said. There will be no checks, like I'm in charge. So, yes, he lied, yes. It's possible he didn't have a clue what he had just negotiated, but surely even the Prime Minister's not that lazy. He must have at least read the executive summary of the report.
Well, one would have thought so.
So that leads, of course, to the resignation of, the, as you said, of the Northern Ireland First Minister, and therefore Michelle O'Neill, the Deputy First Minister, stands down again. So we don't know at the moment what's going to happen. Will there be a replacement? Will they wait until the next elections? Or will there, in fact, be direct rule? So once again, it's feasible that the I've forgotten his name now, the Northern Ireland Secretary, is it Brandon Lewis?
Do you know, I can't remember, there's been so many of them.
So the Northern Ireland Secretary of State may take over and impose direct rule. That would be very awkward, because there's a lot of legislation which Northern Ireland people are waiting on, legislation on social issues which is being worked out. For instance, adoption is one issue that's being discussed.
There's also the big issue about compensation for the institutional child abuse victims, I think. Yeah,
so all
they're
that stuff,
reckoning that might have to fall. Now that's really, really hard for those that have gone through years trying to get redress for some of these crimes that were committed, and they're just going to get dumped upon.
So that's the problem, of course, with direct rulers. It's quite likely that all this legislation might grind to a halt and there won't be any further progress. And the Northern Ireland Health Service is not managing to get as many vaccinations out as the Scottish Health Service, and waiting lists are longer than they are in Scotland. So they need devolution. I don't suppose there's much evidence that having Brandon Lewis running the Northern Ireland Health Service is going to deliver better results. Anyway, I'll look up who exactly is the Northern Ireland Secretary in a minute. Let's have a look at the other issue you raised, of course, of Brandon Lewis. So I'm just hearing it is Brandon Lewis.
Ah, well, there you go. Well done.
You. Northern Ireland Secretary, so he might well be the King of Northern Ireland next week. So the possibility, of course, is that Sinn Féin might become the biggest party, the most popular party in the 6 counties and also in the 26. Now, it's interesting how things have moved on, because Sinn Féin obviously has roots in the Troubles, but it's really a European left-of-centre social democratic party. So is that why Sinn Féin is growing in power now? Because they're actually addressing the issues that ordinary working people on both sides of the border need to address.
I think there's a bit of that. You know, I'm not there, so all I can do is speculate. But I was part of a very interesting forum for a long time, which was the British Irish Parliamentary Association. So I was part of a lot of discussion about things that were going on, and I would imagine that Sinn Féin is seen as, certainly I'm talking about the north of Ireland now, is seen as the more reasonable, because the unionists seem to have dug their heels in about an awful lot over the last few years. And, you know, it's quite interesting. You mentioned earlier, you know, issues about abortion and child abuse and things. And on both sides of the border, Sinn Féin have indeed been seen to be more socially aware on many of these issues than have the unionists in the north of Ireland, for example. So I think there's a bit of that, but I also think things are changing in the north of Ireland too. You know, people are starting to look more, I think, down to the Republic of Ireland as a European nation, with the benefits that the UK government has walked away from and taken us all out of. And they remember too that Northern Ireland voted to stay and to remain in the European Union, same as Scotland did.
Yeah, but unlike Scotland, they got special measures created for them, and Scotland just gets told to put up with it. The other fascinating thing to me, having taught economics before, about what's changed in Northern Ireland and Ireland, is that Ireland has become a lot richer, really, since joining the European Union. Guess what? Since they joined the single market, Ireland has boomed. I'm just looking at World Bank figures, the GDP per capita. Now, that's a very, very useless figure to use, but I'll use it anyway. I'll explain why in a minute. But per head, Northern Ireland has $76,000 measured in dollars, and that's a lot higher than what it is in the UK. Let me see if I can find the UK. The UK is on 44,000. So an average person in the UK, that's assuming everybody got the same. That's why it's a useless measure, because obviously we don't all get the same. But if you divided the total economy by the number of people, on average in Britain we've got 44,000 in US dollars, and in Ireland it's, what did I say?
76.
76, yeah. So basically Ireland is booming, Northern Ireland is not. So that's really, it's the economy, stupid, isn't it? So that just about brings our discussion to the end for this evening. So it's really been about the economy largely, the economic crisis, with inflation back again, with the Bank of England panicking, worried about inflation and having to put interest rates up, on top of the unprecedented doubling and then increasing again of everybody's energy bills. So we've got that kind of double economic crisis on top of the political crisis in Westminster. So what a time to have Boris Johnson in charge.
Oh, my.
Right, so thank you, Linda Fabiani. You've made me feel a lot better to getting these things off my chest, talking to you about them today.
Thank you, Hugh.
So, of course, I have to finish by reminding you, as I said earlier on, that it's getting pretty expensive keeping the electricity bill going here in the studio. So, if you don't know, if you've just joined us, thanks for watching Broadcasting Scotland. We're here every evening, 5 days a week, with Scotland at 7, and we're here again at Sunday lunchtime with the full Scottish. Now, all of these programmes are supported by your donations, so if you are one of our supporters, then thanks. We don't have any other sources of income except yourselves. Now, if you look on the link on the screen, if you would like to become a supporter of Broadcasting Scotland, then please follow the link on our website there on broadcastingscotland.scot. And starting at £5 a month, you can become one of the team. So thanks a lot. So that's it from me today. And so thanks again to Linda Fabiani for joining us up in the Glasgow studio. And that's it for now. I'll see you on Sunday. Bye.